everybody, it's jrobi. Today we're going to be taking a look at a couple of chess games in the Dutch Defence Stonewall variation, and I've selected two games to look at. One's a very old game, but a very famous game in which Najdorf had the black pieces in the Stonewall variation and sacrificed all of his minor pieces to obtain the victory in very dramatic fashion. But the first game we're going to take a look at is a more recent game played at the 37th Chess Olympiad in 2006. And playing white was Marquez, and playing black was Udagalov, and he used his Dutch Defence Stonewall variation. And the reason I selected this game is for two reasons. First of all, it starts off with a little bit different move order than I covered in the Dutch Defence video. So instead of playing an immediate f5 in this position, instead e6 was played. From here, white continued now pawn to c4, and black now pushed up to f5. And from here, white develops the knight now to c3, and black places its knight now on f6. Now, the second reason I chose this game was because it involves an early bishop to g5, which is a comment that came up in my last video. So I thought that this game would be a good illustration of how you can handle bishop to g5. So from here now, play continued now. Black develops its bishop now to e7, and from here, white plays the pawn up to g3. So once again, kind of getting into this fianchetto type structure to dampen a kingside attack that black might be thinking about doing. But from here, black just simply plays now pawn up to d5, so an immediate pawn to d5. White brings the knight out to f3, making way to give the king room to castle. From here, black castles, and white plays the bishop up now to g2. Now, if we stop and take a look at the position so far in comparison to the main line, there are some differences. Obviously, the bishop is on e7 here instead of on d6. D6 is usually the square that the bishop likes to be on in the Dutch Defence Stonewall lines. But with the early bishop to g5, placing the bishop on e7 is a little bit better because, number one, it's protecting the knight, obviously, and furthermore, the bishop is backed up by the queen. So it's completely fine to have the bishop here, and in fact, in a lot of the modern games that I've looked at, the bishop ends up coming to e7 anyway. Secondly, of course, the eternal weakness here for black is going to be the square on e5, which we talked about in the Dutch Defence video, and usually the culprit that can take advantage of that is the knight that swings down here from f3, and of course, black still has the pawn move to c6 probably coming up here shortly. But bishop to g5 early on seemed to be handled pretty handedly here from black by just simply playing the bishop up to e7. Furthermore, now that black is castled, this rook is also contributing to the defense of the f6 knight. So that's one game example anyway of how an early bishop to g5 was handled in the Dutch Stonewall line. So from here now, white does play pawn to c6. So we're virtually in the same setup as we talked about in the video. We have the foundation of the Stonewall structure in place. We have the pawn on c6, of course, helping to support the pawn on d5. And once again, this bishop, although locked in, is doing a couple of important things, protecting the pawn on b7 from a possible queenside expansion from white, and giving a defender here to the pawn on e6 as well. So from this position, play continues now. White castles, and black now brings the knight up to d7. So once again, this knight on f6 is protected by a lot of pieces now, and black just, is continuing on with development in the line. From here now, white captures on d5, and black recaptures with the e-pawn. And from here, we can see that this file here, the e-file, is starting to open up a little bit. And the question is going to be, who's going to be able to capitalize on that the most? From here, white plays a pawn up now to a3, and that's basically limiting the scope of this dark square bishop from coming in possibly to b4. Taking away options is always good. And from here now, white plays queen over to e8. Now, when I first saw this move, I really liked it because it's doing a couple of things. First of all, it's giving the queen access along this diagonal to the castle position of white. And quite often in Dutch defense lines, you'll see a kingside attack. But it's also starting to begin to give black some influence along the e-file that's starting to open up a little bit. So I thought it was a move that served a couple of functions. So from here now, white pushes the pawn up to b4, basically shouting loud and clear that white intends on some queenside activity. But from here now, black plays knight up to e4, and this is doing a couple of things. First of all, it's attacking the knight here on c3 that doesn't have any defenders currently, but it's also opening up the bishops to each other. So white's solution to this position was to capture the bishop here on e7, and when black recaptured, white swung the rook over to c1 to defend the knight on c3. And black probably took a little bit of time in this position thinking about what to play next, because even though white initiated the queenside activity, there are some of white's pieces that just can't contribute on the queenside, whereas black has some options for its pieces. For example, this knight here on e4 is definitely well placed for activity either on the king side or the queen side. We have the queen with nice diagonal access into the queen side, and at some point this knight could play a factor as well. And it wouldn't take a lot to liberate the bishop here on c8 to contribute to the queen side as well. So taking a look at this, black probably thought it would be in his best interest to counterpunch on the queen side by playing pawn up to a5, basically saying to white, okay, you wanted to play on the queen side, let's see what you got. And from this position now, white, it wouldn't be in white's best interest at all to capture the pawn here, because black can just come ripping into the position with the queen takes on a3, and the resulting lines that would follow would favor black, because after knight takes on e4, black can recapture, and you'll notice that this knight is under attack, and from here white can swing the rook over to a1 to kind of get that queen off of this file, attacking the pawn here on a5, or the rook taking the pawn on a5. And once the queen swings over to c3, white's best option here is to get the queen off the table, at which point black can definitely go ahead and do so. And once the knight recaptures, black can swing the knight over now to b6, because this pawn is currently pinned, because the rooks are no longer connected. So if, for example, the pawn takes the knight, the rook falls on a1 and black just stands way better. But nonetheless, like even if we go back to this position here, this knight is going to be a lot more active than this bishop over here on g2. So black definitely stands better in this position. So given that, instead of taking the pawn back here, white decided to bring the queen up now to b3, from which black played pawn takes on b4, and when white recaptures, let's just stop the position here again for a second and think about back to the beginning where we were talking about this queen's influence along the e file. It's going to really shine here because currently the only defender of that pawn is this knight, and that knight can be easily taken care of by black now with knight takes on c3. And when white recaptures, this queen comes tearing into e2, eats up that pawn, and black tries to chase the queen away, but now the queen swings over to a2, and now it looks like white's queenside initiative is coming back to haunt him, because once the queens come off of the table, all we need to do is take a look at the pawn structure. We have black with connected pawns. They're very strong. They're not hard to coordinate with each other, whereas white, on the other hand, has an isolated pawn here on b4. It's got an isolated pawn on d4. So things are definitely starting to favor black quite substantially. Moreover, black is just up a pawn in this position. So white definitely is falling apart. White tries to play pawn to b5, black just takes, and white brings a rook down now to e7. But from here, black just pushes the pawn up to b4, attacking the rook, and when the rook goes over to b3, attacking that pawn, black just hits a check. Now, white kind of made another positional mistake here and blocked the check with the knight. Much better would have been just to bring the rook down, and that would have been a lot better for white in this position, but white opted to block the check with the knight, and by doing so, white willingly walks into the pin, because this rook is now pinning the knight down, and the only defender of that knight is this rook currently. So from here, black came up with a nice little tricky move and played the knight up to f6. Now what this is threatening is playing knight over to e4, separating the rook from the protection of this knight. And white made another positional mistake in this position and played the pawn up now to f3. Better for white would have just been to play the rook back to e3, but instead white decided not to do that, played the pawn up to f3, and can you guess black's move in this position? Black just says, you know what, okay, let's do it, and puts the knight onto e4 anyway. And when white takes that knight and black recaptures, this rook is now separated from the knight, and more importantly, this rook is firmly in control of the f file. So white's really only move in this position is to defend the knight by playing rook over now to e3, at which point black just pushes the pawn up now to b3, and it's all over. White had to resign in this position because there are no good moves. The knight has to be defended on e1, but this pawn is coming to promote, and this rook here on e7 can't access the b file because the bishop here is just protecting the pawn on b7. So really there are no good moves for white in this position. If white tried to just take the pawn to avoid the promotion, black just comes in and hits the check here by taking the knight. Once the check is blocked, black checks again, king goes to g2, and then black just delivers the checkmate here on f2. And so it was all over. I liked how it ended at that nice little pawn move here to b3. So it was definitely an interesting game and quite a bit of dynamic positional play all throughout, and I think that black definitely capitalized on white's mistakes. But now I'd like to change gears a little bit and talk about the Polish Immortal game. Now the Polish Immortal is one of the most famous chess games of all time, and there's a reason for that. It's got a brilliant series of tactical attacks in the game that Najdorf was able to unleash against his opponent. Now, Najdorf was playing black in this position against a gentleman by the name of Glinksberg, and the date of this game is actually up in question. 3 dates are given: 1930, 1935, and 1928. Nobody can say for absolute assurity which year it was, but nonetheless, there is no doubt that the game actually took place. So Najdorf, like I said, he was playing black, and he got into the Dutch Defence Stonewall variation. And we'll just go through the first few moves here pretty quickly. But basically, white opens up with the queen pawn. Najdorf plays a pawn up to f5, and here comes a push to c4 immediately by white. So instead of going for like a fianchetto type structure with the bishop on g2, white is opting for more of a centralization of its pieces. So from here, play continues knight up to f6, and white plays knight up to c3. Now here comes the foundation of the Stonewall structure with pawn to e6, and from here, white plays knight up to f3. So once again, opting for more of a centralization of the pieces as opposed to any kind of fianchetto setup to weaken any kind of kingside attack that black might have. From here comes pawn now to d5, so the Stonewall structure is in place, and white now plays pawn to e3, and black plays pawn to c6, further strengthening the pawn here on d5. White now brings the bishop up to d3. Now this is the most common move in the position from database, but another option for white here, maybe even a little bit better, is to put the bishop onto e2 instead. And that just basically gives a bishop scope to the kingside position of black, and gives a bishop a little bit more options. Right now it's a little bit locked in here on d3, but generally it's not going to stay locked in for long, which is why quite often it's just played out here to d3. So from here now, black plays bishop up to d6, so we're pretty much in the staple Stonewall position here, and white castles and black castles. Now from here, Najdorf's opponent decided to bring the knight over to e2, and possibly what you might have been thinking of is rerouting the knight here to the king side, maybe to give a little bit more options for white against the castle position of black. So it's definitely not a horrible move. It's not a common move in the position though. Instead, what you might see if we flip back a move, you might see white try something like knight to e5, which is a much more common and strong move for white. And there's two possible ways that this could go down for black. The first of which is to capture with the bishop here on e5. This actually doesn't do much for black's position, and in fact it kind of hurts it, because once the pawn recaptures and black places the knight here onto g4, white can play f4, and it creates kind of an anti-Stonewall structure in that white's kind of got a Stonewall structure as well, holding back the black pawns. But there's a fundamental difference in this position that swings the advantage to white, and it kind of all nestles here on the bishop on c8. Now, we talked before about how the bishop is serving some useful functions by protecting the pawn on b7 and protecting the pawn on e6. But now all of a sudden, of course, black still has to use up a lot of moves to get this bishop into the game. Say, for example, bishop to d7, down to e8, up to h5, or even, pushing up the pawn here to b6 and then trying to get the bishop into a6. So this bishop is definitely going to have to, expend a lot of moves to get active. The fundamental difference, of course, is this white bishop here on d3 is a beautifully placed bishop now all of a sudden, because it can just swing over to e2, and then all of a sudden black's going to have to deal with a bishop supported by the queen kind of bearing down on that diagonal. So black definitely does not stand better in this position. In fact, white's going to be setting the pace of the game. So instead of taking with the bishop when the knight comes down to e5, a better line for black is simply to develop its own knight now to d7. And play could continue as follows. White could push the pawn up to f4, but now black can settle its knight down into e4, and when white takes, black can recapture, and then when white saves the bishop, now black can come in and take that knight with its own knight, and when the pawn captures, place the bishop onto e7. So very much an equal position from here, but definitely a lot cleaner and a lot better to play from the black perspective in comparison to the messy position that results here, where the white bishop is just going to get into the game and start ripping things up. But nonetheless, that wasn't what was played in the game. He played knight over to e2, and from here now black simply developed the knight up to d7. White continued knight down to g5. Now when Najdorf saw this knight to g5 move, his tactical brain probably just started buzzing, because while the knight is attacking the pawn here on e6, it also vacated the defense of the h2 pawn, and lo and behold, we have this nice bishop carving along this diagonal, and Najdorf definitely saw that and went ahead and captured that pawn with his bishop. And the reason being is because at at worst, black's going to be a pawn up in the position, because white has two options. White can either move the king to safety, or it can take the bishop. Now, if white would have taken the bishop with the king, black has the very strong check here with knight to g4, and when the king moves to safety, the knight on g5 falls, and black is up a pawn. Now, white isn't in a very dangerous position yet, because white can simply play knight to f4, and then once black brings a queen to h4, the knight can snug in on h3, preventing any kind of mating threats. But black is still up a pawn, even though the position is, very much still equal. But it's better to be up a pawn than nothing. But instead of playing that, after the bishop captured on h2, white decided to move the king to safety to h1 to get the king out of the check. Play continued now. Knight goes up to g4 to protect that bishop, and then from here, f4 is pushed by white. Now, f4 is protecting the knight on g5, but now black plays a very nice move, queen to e8, and all of a sudden this queen is going to be infiltrating into the position, and there's not a lot that white's going to be able to do to stop it. For example, the knight here on e2 is blocking the diagonal axis of the queen. This bishop is still very much hemmed in, as with this bishop. So black is definitely going to get a lot more activity out of this position as opposed to white. So from here now, what white wanted to do is to play g3 to give its king an escape square from the position, because this queen is definitely going to be coming into the position, and white wants to be able to reroute that king, get it out of the corner. So play continues now, queen to h5, and now the white king goes to g2. And just take a look at this position. It's really beautiful. Like, Najdorf is creating a very strong attacking position. We have the queen on h5, we have the knight on g4, we have the bishop on h2. We even have the pawns contributing to the attack, because both the f and the d pawns are covering the square here on e4. The knight is covering the square on f2. So the options for the white king are very much limited, but the real question is, how do you continue the attack here? Now, Najdorf was a very strong tactical positional player, and from this position he came up with a brilliant move. Now, if you want to take a moment and pause the video and see if you can find the move, definitely go ahead and do so. But in that position, Najdorf found bishop to g1. And from here, white's in a lot of trouble, because simply if white were to take, say, for example, with the rook, it's going to be checkmate in two more moves. The queen will just come over and snag that right up. So that's definitely not an option. Alternatively, if white tries to play the king over to f3, well, that's just checkmate in one move, because the queen sweeps into h1 and delivers the checkmate. The king has no escape squares. So really, the only play from this position for white was to capture with the knight here on g1. Well, play continued from this point, queen check on h2, and the king goes over now to f3. And take a look at the position now. We have this queen protecting all the squares here on this rank. The king can't access any of those. The king still can't access the square on e4, and the king can't do anything about the knight on g4. But the question is, how does black continue the attack? Once again, is there a way that black can open things up to continue the attack? Well, Najdorf came up with another good move. He played pawn up now to e5, and he's opening things up even farther, because once the pawn captures, well, take a look at this knight here on d7. It's just eyeing up the pawn on e5, and here comes a very nice sacrifice from Najdorf. So he captures with the knight on e5, landing the check. The king has absolutely no squares to go to, so that knight has to be taken. And once the knight is taken, Najdorf lands the check again. Now, in this position, the king does have one escape square, and that's the square on f4. And once the king goes there, Najdorf lands the check again, forces the king back to f3, and in this position, Najdorf plays the pawn up now to f4. So he's giving back even more material. So from here, after the pawn takes, Najdorf plays bishop up to g4. And white is in a horrible position, because first of all, white's in check, and what's behind that king, of course, is the queen. So white definitely cannot just move the king away. White has to take that bishop. Now, once white does so, Najdorf again throws another piece away by playing knight to e5, landing the check. And in this position, the enemy king has no escape squares again, because the knight is protecting f3. The knight's also putting the king in check here, and of course the rook has taken away all these squares, and the queen has taken away all these squares. So that knight has to be taken in this position. And when that knight falls, can you see the mate in one? Because there is one move that will win the entire game in this position, and it's nice little little pawn move, h5, checkmate. And that's the Polish Immortal game. Like, I mean, it is just an utterly amazing game that Najdorf played, and his tactical thinking and lines of attack were just, it's quite breathtaking, actually, if you think about it. So, hopefully these two games will better round out the Dutch Stonewall variation and be a good supplement to my first video on the subject. And I definitely think that the Dutch defense in and of itself is a very interesting opening strategy from black against the queen's pawn opening. It creates a very imbalanced position early on and requires more tactical strength as opposed to deep theory book lines. So in other words, you don't have to be booked up to the gills to have some success with the Dutch Defence Stonewall. So take care, hope you enjoy the video, and we'll see you next time.